Welcome to Fins, Fur, and Feathers, the fish and wildlife management podcast at K-State Research and Extension. I'm Dr. Drew Ricketts.
And I'm Dr. Joe Gergen. We're both lifelong hunters and anglers, K-State Research and Extension specialists who help citizens with their fish, wildlife, and pond management needs. If you've ever had a wildlife or pond management challenge, then this is the podcast for you.
We address common fish and wildlife management problems using a scientific approach to provide proven and practical solutions to the issues that you may be facing.
Well, welcome back to another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers. We're going to talk this week about a terrestrial topic, Drew. We're going to talk about some flying European starlings.
That's right. So starlings are one of those bird species that apparently our ancestors who came over from Europe couldn't live without. It reminded them of home. They had this beautiful bird that was included in some of Shakespeare's work and all that kind of stuff, and they had to bring them here.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of starlings, and beautiful bird isn't what comes to mind right off the bat, but hey, I guess different folks, different strokes, right? So
yeah.
Perspective is key. Maybe it's just bringing you back home to that hometown European feeling. So miss something from home, the calls maybe have something to do with it. But where did you said they were brought over, so they're not native to North America. How'd they get here?
Well, in around 1890, they were introduced to Central Park. And I've read somewhere, I think it was actually in the book that I used for human-wildlife conflicts, but I didn't have time to go look that up to find the source. But I remember them talking about the fact that it took 100 different introduction attempts to get starlings to take.
Wow.
So it's an example of a species that, if they'd have just tried one or two times, we wouldn't have bothering us these days. But when they took, they took.
Yeah, they sure did. So there's a few more than what they introduced. I think it may have taken 100 times. They didn't introduce that many to start with, did they?
No,
it was a pretty small group. I think it was like 100 or something.
Yeah, it would have been a small number of individuals, and that 100 or so that they originally introduced by 1984. That number had grown to about 200 million birds.
200 million?
In North America, which at that time was estimated to be about a third of the global population of starlings.
Wow.
And just like a lot of passerine birds, or what we would call songbirds, they've declined from that. And currently it's estimated that we've got about 100 million starlings in the United States, or North America, so Canada, U.S., and Mexico.
Where are they found? Are they found east to west, north to south?
Yeah, they're found throughout the North American continent. I'm sure that there's a northern limit to their range up in Canada, but I don't know exactly where that's at.
East to west, they're found.
Yep.
Ubiquitously across the 48. So quite a bit of them around. I think most of us know what a starling is, right? A little songbird. Are they a songbird? Are they classified as a songbird?
Yeah, they're a passerine, which passerines are songbirds. But they're a sort of a medium-sized, smallish bird. They're a lot bigger than a hummingbird, but they're nowhere near as big as a hawk. So they're in that smaller bird range. They're sort of black with speckles, iridescent speckles all over them, and I think that's probably why people thought they were pretty. Got lots of different blackish birds that will flock up. They're the ones with the yellow beak. That's another thing you can use to differentiate them.
Yeah. Well, why are we focused on them? Why do we care about European starlings other than there's a bunch of them?
Sure. Well, during the wintertime especially, they get in these really, really big flocks. The rest of the year, they're sort of scattered about. They're nesting, doing their reproduction stuff after the chicks hatch and they're able to fly. Then they'll sort of get into smaller flocks, but then in fall and winter, especially through late winter, we can get really, really big flocks, sometimes up to 1 million birds.
In one flock?
Yeah, in one flock. And this is that bird species, so if you're driving around and you see these big flocks of black birds that sort of move like amoebas, their shape shifts all as they go through the sky. That's usually starlings.
I get really excited seeing that because it reminds me of School of Fish. And one of the things that I've learned about fish is that when they're flying in those groups, you can't predict any movement of any one individual, but you can predict how the whole school is going to fly. So I always get in my head about the movement of each of those individuals and how somehow they all know what they're doing. They're not crashing into each other. So pretty neat to see. But I imagine seeing those big flocks flying around. They're pretty patterns. But if you own an agricultural field or a dairy lot, they're probably not something you want to have on your land.
Right, yeah. So in the United States alone, starlings are estimated to cause a little over $1 billion in damage.
With a B?
Yeah, with a B. Billion. Wow. With a B. The number's more like 1.14 billion. So when we get as large as 1 billion, that 0.14, that's actually 140 million.
Oh yeah.
So that's still a whole lot of money, even
not a rounding error when we're talking about that much.
Yeah. So, lots and lots of damage to agricultural production. We'll talk more in depth about that a little bit later. The things that affect the daily lives of the vast majority of people in the U.S. are the types of damage that starlings can cause in town. And we may not think about that a lot, but if you walk around and you see lots of bird poop on the sidewalk in town, starlings are one of the species that does a lot of that. They like to nest in cavities, so any sort of nook and cranny they can find in a building, like the eaves and that sort of thing, they'll nest in. They'll perch on the edge or the eaves of buildings, and a lot of times there's doors to businesses under those things, so they'll perch right over the top of the entryway to a business and poop on your head when you're trying to walk in, which isn't a good thing.
Are there reasons to be concerned about the poop other than it's unsightly? I mean, why are we concerned about it? Well, I guess if there's a million birds, maybe there's enough to worry about.
Yeah, poop's nasty stuff, right? I mean, it's got, in addition to just being processed food, there's also a lot of times critters living in that poop, and that's what we're most worried about. E. coli is a common bacteria that would be in there. Salmonella is another bacteria that we have to worry about. We've got this high-path avian influenza that's going around right now. That's definitely something that starlings can transmit, probably through their feces, but also directly through their interactions with other critters and that sort of thing. So, that we can also have feces accumulations in parking lots or around trees where there are large roosts during the wintertime of these birds, where like the feces can accumulate overnight so densely on the bark of a tree that it can damage the tree.
Oh, wow.
I've seen hoods of cars that were totally white from starling poop from just overnight. And so that's the kind of feces accumulations that we're talking about. When we think about the kinds of agricultural damage that they can cause, crop depredation is probably the most underestimated kind of damage that they can do. It's going to mainly be small grains, and especially small grains that are plants that are stiff enough and tall enough that they can perch on, like milo or grain sorghum. So they can do an incredible amount of damage to grain sorghum, but that's hard to measure. Yeah. Right, so we don't have necessarily a good idea how much of that they do. The damage that they do at feedlots and dairies is something we have a little bit better handle on. It's estimated that one starling can consume 2.2 pounds of feed in a month, and 2.2 pounds doesn't sound like all that much feed. In a month sounds like a fairly long period of time.
Yeah.
Right? But when we start thinking about the fact that when starlings start to gather at feedlots and dairies, there tends to be, at a small end, tens of thousands of them, and at the upper end, we said 1 million, right, in a flock. And those flocks can hang out at these feedlots and dairies for several months. This is the time of the year when that's worst, January, February through early March, when it's bad winter time. They're looking for those really high calorie and high fat rations that we feed at feedlots and dairies, because they need all of that energy to stay warm and keep from losing a lot of weight. And so, if we have 50,000, even thinking about sort of a lower number, if we have 50,000 starlings that are at a feedlot for a month, then that's 50,000 birds that are consuming 2.2 pounds of feed a day. That's 50 tons.
Yeah, that adds up
of feed. Yeah. So just the feed consumption itself can be really expensive. There was a 2011 study that found, and this was done here at K-State in Kansas, that found that the cost of production for having starlings at a feedlot was $1 per stalker per day. So feed has increased, of course, in cost in Kansas since 2011, probably by quite a bit.
Yeah.
So there's not a huge profit margin when we start thinking about cattle and how much how much profit there is, per animal, and so that can really add up. Dairy cattle and feedlot cattle as well, but we in dairy cattle we can see reduced milk production, and we see a reduction in average daily gain, not just because of the feed consumption effects in feedlot cattle too, and a lot of that has to do with behavioral changes that we see in those animals. So dairy cattle, in a very recent study that was published just a couple of years ago, showed that the dairy cattle are more aggressive towards one another when there's all these starlings around. So, if you think about having all of these birds, or let's put it into something that we might see, if you've got flies all over your plate of food and you need to try and eat off of that plate that's got flies all over it, you're constantly shooing those flies away. Well, if you think about a cow trying to eat out of a trough, and that trough is full of birds that are eating the same food that the cow's eating, that cow's trying to bump those birds out of the way so it can get a bite. The birds are probably jumping up and landing on its head, and that's making it mad. All those sorts of things, and so they're able to get less food, but they're agitated. Sometimes the dairy cattle and the feedlot cattle will sort of get depressed because they're constantly competing with those birds, and because of that sort of depressed mentality, then they consume less food as well. So less milk produced, less weight gained by feedlot cattle, and then we're also losing lots and lots and lots of dollars in feed.
Yeah, we're getting hit multiple directions there, right? So definitely an issue. The birds are also probably defecating on that food to some degree, or on the animals as well. And you mentioned, a couple of those diseases earlier that might be transmitted. Are they primarily transmitted through the animals eating that contaminated feed, or are there other ways it's spread? So
it would depend on which diseases we're talking about. So especially if we're thinking about salmonella in feedlot cattle and dairy cattle, that would be from the birds defecating on the feed, and then the cattle eating that feed that's got the bird feces on it. The high path avian influenza, that can be transmitted lots of different ways, right? That can be transmitted by people who might have the avian influenza virus on their clothes. People can also be infected by it, right? So if a person had avian influenza that they picked up either from another cow or somehow from a bird, then that can be transmitted. But if those birds are constantly interacting with the cattle, direct transmission from the birds or potentially through their excreta, that's another way that they could pass it on.
Yeah, and even if it's a small risk chance, when you start having numbers like tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, a million birds, that risk starts to become into a real risks that might be realized on these farms.
Sure.
So they're going to be eating food, they're potentially eating crops, they're reducing the output, and there are problems in urban settings too, right? So is there anything we can do about them if they are showing up?
Sure. There's a number of things we can do. If we start sort of on the options that might work in lots of different settings, I don't know if you've ever gone to the bank in downtown Manhattan, Kansas at 2 o'clock in the morning, but sometimes you'll roll into the bank and the lights will be on and there's this annoying screeching sound being played. Have you ever heard that, Joe?
I don't think I have. I'm normally not at the bank at 2 in the morning.
2 o'clock in the morning is probably an exaggeration. But sometimes, we'll go into a business, into the parking lot at night, and you'll hear this kind of sort of playing over a speaker. Maybe you don't know it's playing over a speaker. Maybe you think it's in a tree or something. But a lot of times that's a starling distress sound that's being played, and that's being played to try and disperse the starlings that might be roosting in those trees in that parking lot. So that's an example of a kind of sound that we can use to haze them. We could also use sort of like banging noises. There are some pyrotechnic devices called bird bangers, and it's basically a firecracker, right? We can make loud sounds like that. Sometimes we might add a siren in there if we're in a situation like at a feedlot or a dairy. Sometimes they'll add devices to their feed trucks to help disperse these birds, and so one of the things on those feed trucks might be a siren. It might be blaring a starling distress sound and maybe make a pop every once in a while too, like a loud bang. Those sounds, when we're just using sound by themselves, a lot of times the birds will habituate to them. Yeah. They just get used to it, no longer seems like a threat, and so they're no longer dispersed. We can also use lasers, and when we're talking about lasers, not the kind that can cut things, right? But also much more intense, bright, bigger spots than the laser that your cat might play with in your house. So it might look like a big flashlight that has a really intense light beam, and if you shine that directly on roosted birds, it can make them fly away sometimes. Flashing bright strobe lights can do that same sort of thing. Lights by themselves, including lasers, tend to be something that the starlings also habituate to, so they get used to them. But when we combine the sound with the lights or the lasers, then that can have longer-term efficacy. And those devices that they make for the feed trucks a lot of times will include a starling distress sound, a siren, and flashing lights on top. The cattle get used to it when you're feeding them. It's not that big of a deal, but it can disperse the starlings.
That there's a term for that when you start using multiple techniques to get rid of animals or get rid of problem animals, but that integrated pest management. And I mention that because I think, we may have said that other places, but that's a term that's getting tossed around a lot. And it's basically just, taking a couple different approaches and putting them together. And maybe you change up those, the pairings that you have over time too. So one of the types of acoustics that I'm familiar with from birds in my studies is it's called an acoustic net or a sound barrier. And so it kind of sounds like a washing machine, but basically what it does is it disrupts the ability of the birds to communicate. So I don't know if it'd work here. Do starlings, talk to each other and say, hey, there's something scary, or what's the interactions there?
They're constantly making noise, so that could be something that might be effective.
Yeah. It's fun to think about, right?
Yeah. I haven't seen any studies specifically on that with starlings, but I know it's something that works with other species. So if it's not something that's been tried on starlings, maybe it's something that they ought to.
Yeah, sure.
The other challenge with that though is if it's something that bothers the cattle,
right, then
it could change their behavior too. So it's got to be something that's compatible with the cattle production as well.
Figuring out how to scare away those animals, those birds, without disrupting the cattle. There's an extra play on there, and some of those lasers are really intense. I'm surprised that the cattle don't respond to them, But I guess if you were shining them at them, maybe that'd be different than shining them in the trees where they're roosting.
Yeah, I think the lasers in that setting would typically be they would shine up where the birds are roosting rather than down where the cattle are at. So they may not even, they'd see them flashing on the wall, but that's it.
Yeah, wouldn't be hitting them in their eyes or anything like that. You mentioned earlier that especially with like a business, and I know I've seen little, I'm sure they have a fancy name, but little spikes above windows or doors or businesses. So, would those work in the settings you're talking about?
They definitely work in the urban settings where we've got birds that are perching over doorways. Those are called porcupine wires. And it's, there's lots of different versions of them. Some of them are metal, some of them are plastic, but it's a spike that a bird doesn't want to land on, basically. And I think you have to use the right kind, though, for the bird that you're dealing with, because I have seen some of those where the spikes look kind of like plastic icicles, and they were spread fairly far apart, but they had some large surface area on them, and smaller birds like sparrows were actually making nests in them.
Yeah.
So they didn't quite have the kind that they needed to have. Another thing that you can do in that same sort of setting is on that ledge, instead of having a ledge, you put an angled piece of material on there, and so there's nothing to perch on. If they tried to sit on that angled piece of material, they would slide down and slide off. The porcupine wires, the areas that we're trying to exclude birds from in the feedlots and dairies, we're talking about maybe a 200-foot long by 100-foot wide building. And all of the structural members that would be underneath the roof in that large of a building, it would be cost preventative to try and put porcupine wires on every one of those.
Sure.
What sometimes they do when they are able to think about this before they pick the materials, though, is to pick materials that might have an angle already built into them, maybe as part of the structural support. So on an I-beam, that bottom ledge of the I-beam might have an angle going back from the ledge to the eye, right, or the upright part of the eye. Another thing that is available that is oftentimes used in large industrial buildings or open canopy type industrial buildings where you got a big roof but no sides on the walls is netting that sucks up tight to the underneath sides of those purlins, or the structural beams in there. And that's something that might have some promise in dairies and feedlot settings too, if we can find some that's cost effective. If you're doing a smaller scale, then it's pretty cost effective, but figuring out a way to do that to a very large building efficiently. And I was actually talking to our dairy specialist about this morning because I got to thinking about it for this. And, one of the things he brought up was there's a lot of dust in these facilities. What happens when the dust starts to accumulate on that netting? Is it all going to sag? Is it going to fall down? Is it going to have much life? So there are lots of things to think about there, but it might be something worth trying. When we're thinking about parking lots and that sort of thing, one of the conversations I've had with some of the hotels I've worked with in Western Kansas is, maybe you ought to just get rid of the trees. I know that's not something that you want to do. It's pretty drastic. That's a situation where you've got a beautiful tree in the parking lot. Maybe those are the only trees around, right? But if the birds are producing that much mess and you can't get that roost dispersed, then you might have to remove the trees.
Are those birds going to leave the area, or are they just going to go over to the hotel and find a place to roost there?
They're probably going to go to the next parking lot that's got trees in it.
Yeah, there you go. Push it off on your neighbor. But, hey, sometimes you got to do that, right?
Yeah.
When I were thinking about aquatic settings, a lot of birds of prey, herons come in and will eat a lot of fish, and that's money out of the pockets, right?
Yeah.
These starlings, I didn't realize it, but you think of a small bird, it probably doesn't have that much of an impact, but you've said that it does. So I'm wondering, if all the above don't work, with farmers or fish farmers, they have that depredation permit. They can go out and they can lethally harvest a small number of birds that are causing problems. That might be hard to do if you have a flock of 10,000, but are there lethal methods of control?
Sure, and shooting is one that's used sometimes, but the reality, it's a drop in the bucket. What you can shoot, typically when they first start moving in, somebody might stand outside a dairy parlor or something like that, or a freestall barn is what they have a lot of times at dairies, and shoot the starlings before they're able to get in, or shoot them when they're coming out. But it's a very small percentage of the birds, but that also, you're hazing them when you're doing that, right? And that may deter some from coming in there and roosting. And if you can prevent them from starting roosting, then that can be beneficial. The main form of lethal control that's used on these starlings, and there's no protections for them. They're considered a nuisance bird by the federal government, and in our state of Kansas, they're a nuisance bird, so there's no protections. There are a couple of toxicants that can be used on them. The one that is a restricted use toxicant that is available to pesticide applicators would be Avitrol. And Avitrol is kind of a weird toxicant. You can't apply it in high enough concentrations that they all get it. But the ones that consume it, end up just sort of acting crazy. They squawk, make the distress sounds, they fly weird, they flop around, and it can spook some of the other birds away. That's more of a dispersal technique than a way to kill a whole bunch of birds. If you have 50,000 starlings or 100,000 starlings or 150,000 starlings that settle in on a feedlot or a dairy for a month and it's cold and you need to get rid of them, then you can work with the USDA. They've got a cost share program, and they've got a toxicant that they call DRC 1339. And that one, basically you establish a bait station that's out away from where you're feeding the cattle, and you end up mixing it with the fats that they mix with the cattle feed, and once you've got starlings coming to that feed, then USDA will come in, apply the toxicant to the feed, and kill a bunch of starlings. The challenge with that is where do they go? Are they all roosting at the dairy? Because we've now basically got a bunch of toxic waste that we got to clean up. Yeah. So they don't die right where they consume the feed. They die when they go back to roost. And if they're roosting in town, then it was raining dead birds in town, and that's not a good thing. So this is a pretty technical process where you have to figure out where the birds are roosting, figure out what they're feeding on, what part of a ration. Sometimes it's a very specific part of the ration. Then you apply the toxicant, and then usually a wheel loader is involved in cleaning up the dead birds.
Wow, quite a few.
Yeah.
Can it pass on to other animals if something came and ate that bird? Do you know if it could make them sick?
It's not very toxic to mammals, if I remember correctly. Yeah. But it is something that needs to be cleaned up, to prevent any secondary toxicity. I don't know the details on that one as well as I do a lot of the toxicants, because it's not something that I can apply, and it's not something I can teach producers how to apply. It's something that the USDA is entirely in control of.
Yeah. So the population of European starlings, in North America, you said it peaked maybe 20 years ago or something, and it's come down a little bit, but it still seems like it's really high, right? Is that right?
Yeah, it is. And I don't remember if I said this before, but this is on the IUCN's list of it's one of 3 bird species that are considered the most impactful or the worst invasive species in the world.
Wow.
So it's a species that's incredibly abundant. Even if we're killing 40 or 50,000 at a time, that's a drop in the bucket.
Are they migrating north to south? Are we seeing big numbers, move into Kansas, or was it just showing up this time of year because they don't have anywhere else to go and anything else to eat?
It's more that they're concentrating because of reduced food or because of how cold it is, and they're finding the best food that's available to them. They're not a migratory species, but some of the birds that are way up north will come a little bit south to escape some cold.
Sure. If it's listed as one of the worst birds, or worst species, I guess you said, right? Potential for loss. What else? What can we do is there anything on a small scale that if we're listening and we don't own a big dairy farm or we don't own a big farm, is there anything I can do to help with this, or is it kind of just, it's a problem and we're going to deal with it?
Well, the one thing that a lot of people can do to help with this that a lot of people don't want to hear is that, having a bird feeder is one way that we contribute to a lot of species like this. So if you've got a bird feeder in your yard, I know we oftentimes associate bird feeders with being good for the birds, but most of the studies out there show that there's either no benefit to the bird species or that they're detrimental. Oh, wow. To them. They can reduce the hatchability of eggs. They can reduce the survivability of chicks, which doesn't make any sense, but there was a study in Europe that found that. Another thing that bird feeders often do is attract other nuisance critters to the yard like skunks and raccoons and foxes and all those sorts of critters. But, starlings are a species that definitely benefits from bird feeders in yards. So if you're worried about this and how you could potentially be contributing to it, if you got a bird feeder and you see lots of starlings at your bird feeder, well, it might be a good thing to not feed those birds.
Is there anything I can do to get some of those birds to my backyard other than a bird feeder?
Well, bird baths are used, but the one of the challenges associated with bird baths is we get some of the same disease transmission risks with bird baths. Really, the best thing you can do for native birds in your yard is to plant native plants. There's lots of different flowering native plants that produce food for birds. Also, native plants that can produce good cover during the wintertime. Lilac bushes aren't a native species here, but that's one that produces a lot of great cover. Fragrant sumac, to me, that's a real pretty bush. It gets those nice bright red berries on them during the summertime. That's about as good a bird cover as you can have, and it does make a pretty nice shrub out in the yard. So, you can attract birds with cover that way. Just about any sunflower species is going to produce all kinds of great food for them. Thistles. Niger thistle seed is something that a lot of people put in bird feeders. You can have a native garden that's got thistle plants out in it. If somebody had some Maximilian sunflower and some annual sunflowers, some stiff sunflower and some thistles out in their garden, you may not be popular in your neighborhood because some people might think you've got a weed patch out there, but you could have lots of plants that would benefit pollinators, benefit the birds, give them lots of good cover and food, and that would be better than putting a bunch of millet out there and a feeder that's going to attract those starlings.
Sounds dangerously close to talking about habitat management again.
Well, yeah, lots of parallels between the things that we talk about, whether we're talking about managing for things in a yard or managing for things out in nature.
Well, Drew, that was really insightful. I've known that European starlings were around. I knew they were an introduced species. I did not realize how much of a problem that they were, in agriculture and just throughout our area. So thanks for sharing that today. Thanks to all our listeners for listening to another great episode, and make sure you're following us along, liking us, and checking out our YouTube channel for up-to-date videos that can help you with your pond and wildlife management needs. Fins, Fur, and Feathers is hosted by K-State Research and Extension and is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network.
The network and this podcast are supported by the Renewable Resources Extension Act.